Good evening everyone. The topic for tonight is the fifth utility service. I've called Wi-Fi or broadband or internet or whatever you want to call it the fifth utility service because, as we'll see through some examples that I will share with you, tenants now view this as an essential service, in some cases more essential than heat and hot water. In putting this presentation together, I did do a little bit of research. So my background is in corporate. I spent 20 years climbing the corporate ladder in a FTSE 100 company in a highly regulated industry. So I'm used to dealing with the legal side of things, and that's usually what I present on. Interestingly, there's no legal requirement to provide internet, phone or TV services in rented properties. But I guess if you said that to your tenants, they would just be in shock and horror, and you would really struggle, particularly a HMO, to be renting out rooms there. The focus of this presentation is going to be on HMOs, but this is also a consideration for single lets as well. So with single lets, the tenant chooses their service provider, so for gas, electric, obviously not water, because there's no competition in that area, but they can choose their own service provider for internet. However, you still might want to be involved in that decision. Let's say, for example, that your tenant decides to go with Sky. Sky might then say, okay, we need to install a satellite dish on your property. If you have just spent 80 or 100k renovating a property and you've had it externally K-rendered, which isn't cheap, you probably don't want your tenant phoning Sky up and then some random guy coming along with a hammer and a screwdriver messing up your nice new rendering, putting up a satellite dish. Or your property might be in a conservation area, for example. You might, in some cases, need planning permission to put up a satellite dish. So you can't completely wash your hands of this decision with your tenant for single lets. It is worth being involved. I would suggest that during the refurbishment, if you can, make sure that you have fibre optic to the property as part of the refurb, and then that is going to be the default option for the tenant. That is going to be the most preferable option. Now, I've ended up talking about internet provision in HMOs because when we first started this, it's probably, 9-10 years ago now, we got our first HMO. We had constant complaints from tenants about the Wi-Fi provision. One of our largest property is a 10-person HMO. And when we first started 10 years ago, the tenants were all Polish immigrants, and lots of Polish migrant workers were influxing into the UK, which was great for us. We had queues of tenants, queuing around the corner. We couldn't rent out rooms fast enough. We even put satellite in so that they could watch Polish TV in the HMO. That's how many people we had, and we wanted to keep our tenants happy, so we were really quite worried about these constant complaints. So we put a lot of time and effort into working out what the problem was and what a solution was, and that's what I'm going to be sharing with you this evening. Now, there's a lot of people, including letting agents, I'm in lots of Facebook forums with other agents that just simply aren't aware of these systems. So hopefully you'll find what I'm going to share with you this evening very useful indeed. Now, a little bit about internet service providers. Again, in researching this presentation, I did a quick Google search, and we all know not to believe everything you read on Google. However, I was presented with a statistic that there's over 150 broadband service providers in the UK, which really did surprise me. Now, I guess that's because we and our clients tend to work with the largest and most well-known. So I'm sure you'll have heard of BT. I've already mentioned Sky, TalkTalk, Virgin Media and EE are the ones that we come across and work with on a regular basis. Now, if you are looking for a service provider for your new HMO, there are switching sites available, so like USwitch or Money Saving Expert, or these various different sites which you can do comparisons on to find the best deal for you. Just bear in mind that a lot of these comparison sites only really look at the top 20 service providers, so as long as you're happy with that, that's fine, but don't think it's a whole of market service, because it isn't. So just a little bit of an aside there to let you know. When you are looking at Wi-Fi packages, they'll probably advertise the headline download speeds, and these can start from anything, and I'm going to say as little as 11 megabytes per second. Now, what I would say is that I am not a techie expert. So what I'm sharing with you this evening is basically the extent of my knowledge. But as we'll see, 11 megabytes is just simply not adequate for particularly a HMO, and even these days I would say for a single let. Now, when we started, again, I'm showing my age a little bit here, 10 years ago, you would buy an internet package for your property, and it would probably be for a limited amount of data download for a month. And if you went over that, you'd either be charged an extortionate amount, or they would do something called throttling, which basically meant that they reduced the speed through which you could download data almost to dial-up speeds. So it became worse and useless. That's gone away now, and you'll see if you do a quick search on those top well-known service providers, when you're looking at their headlines, they'll go, oh, 180 megabyte download speed, unlimited downloads. And that's why they say unlimited downloads, because there used to be that limit on it. But that issue has really gone away, which is good. It's good for us. The other thing to bear in mind is that there aren't any specific HMO landlord packages. So you can get a residential package or you can get a business package, but there aren't specific HMO landlord packages. Now, hopefully this will change in future, but not at the moment. There is one service provider called Landlord Broadband that I think have twigged that there is a market for HMO landlord, but their service provision is essentially a residential package. All they've done is put a name on it, really. It's no different than any other package that you can buy. And in fact, they actually piggyback. I think it's on the back of BT or EE networks. So then they're not a unique service provider. What I would say going forwards, if you're doing HMOs now, is do look at business packages. They're available from all the same suppliers. The benefit is that you get greater bandwidth, faster speeds. The customer service is a lot better as well, so you can actually pick the phone and talk to somebody. With Virgin Media, for example, if you're on a residential package, you've got to do everything through a chat box. You can't actually pick the phone up and speak to anyone. The slight downside with the business packages is you are tied into a contract for a lot longer. So residential packages, you'll be probably about 12 months. With business contracts, you're looking 18 to 24 months. So do bear that in mind. Let's have a look at things internet providers don't tell you. When you're looking at their websites and you're looking at the various different packages and they go, oh, 180 megabyte download, you might see there's a little asterisk next to that number. If you scroll all the way down the page to the bottom of the website, and it could be a long scroll to find out what that asterisk means, it will say something along the lines of, advertised speeds are only based on 50% of customers' experiences and not necessarily guaranteed. So just because it says that in the headline doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to get that level of service even if you buy that package. And the reason for that is that many service providers use the Openreach or BT network. A little history lesson, we used to have BT. BT used to be the national telephone provider, and the main infrastructure network in the UK is essentially still the old BT telephony network, and that is mostly cabling, copper cabling. And that's the main infrastructure throughout the UK. Now, when BT was privatised, I should say, it was split out. So you've got Openreach and BT. So one is the infrastructure, one is the customer service side of the business. And essentially, all of the network, all of the other service providers, with the exception of Virgin, use the BT infrastructure. So EE, TalkTalk, whatever. I mean, Sky's a little bit different because they might have satellite or whatever. But apart from Virgin, they all use the BT network. So if the BT network in your area to your property is NAF, it doesn't really matter which service provider you go with, they'll all be NAF. Virgin has its own network, so when the telephone industry was privatised, lots of companies sprang up to start digging up the streets and installing their own fibre optic cabling, and Virgin is essentially the only one of those companies that has survived. So Virgin does have its own network, but when I last looked online, and again, take everything online with a pinch of salt, Virgin only service 57% of the UK population, so it's not available in all locations. And this getting a little bit technical, but hopefully it helps to explain why your internet service provision might not be as good as you think it is, or as good as what you're paying for. There is a difference between what is known as fibre to the cabinet and fibre to the premises. Let me try and explain this. So, as I said, the original infrastructure is copper cabling, and most BT have got a programme where they are looking to replace the copper cabling with fibre optic across as much of their network as they possibly can. This started many years ago, but is still being rolled out, so it's not in place everywhere yet. However, what they have done is they have taken the fibre optic across the network to a cabinet. Now, you might have seen like these the like rectangular green metal boxes at the end of roads, or at, you know, the end of estates. And occasionally you'll see a workman in a high-vis vest on a little chair fiddling about inside it. These are the phone cabinets, the telephony cabinets. And what happens is that they'll put fibre optic to the cabinet, but then the cabling from the cabinet to the homes that that cabinet supplies is still copper. And I know this for a fact because we've had this issue in my own personal house. We signed up for a very high-speed business package with BT some time ago now, and we just weren't getting the speeds that we thought we should be getting, that we were paying for. We were doing all sorts of ping tests, speed tests, it just wasn't happening. And so we complained, and they sent out new routers, higher spec routers. We must have had 4 or 5 engineers over about 6 months, and eventually we got through to somebody in customer services who knew what they were talking about. And essentially what he said was we would never get the speeds we were paying for down copper cabling to our house. So they actually released us from that contract early because they couldn't provide the service that we were paying for. Now, fortunately for us, in talking to our neighbour at that time, we discovered that Virgin had actually laid fibre optic down our road, so we could get the higher speeds, but only through Virgin. And so it is important to understand the difference. So fibre to the premises is where you have got fibre optic to each individual property. Now, this is obviously much more preferable. This means that fibre optic can maintain the higher download speeds directly to the property, which is great, and that is what you want. However, it's not available in all locations. What I would also caveat that with saying is that even if you have got fibre to the premises, you still might have some internet service issues. We have a HMO in Wigan that we manage, and this does have fibre optic to the premises. However, the location where this property is a very densely populated area where there's lots of big old Victorian houses that have all been converted to flats or HMOs. So even though there is fibre to the premises, because of the such high demand of population in such a small area, there is still a lot of demand for internet connectivity and download. So our client at this particular property is paying for a service package of, I think, 150 meg download speed, but the service provider will only guarantee speeds of up to 70 megabyte. to that property. So again, it is worth understanding the infrastructure, because it might not be that you can get the service that you want to your property, and that unfortunately is part of our historical legacy of having that old infrastructure. What you can do is use a postcode checker. So many suppliers will allow you to put in the postcode of your property, your HMO, and it will tell you which Wi-Fi supplier can actually deliver the speeds to your property and what those guaranteed speeds are. So when you are looking at packages, it is worth just asking the question, okay, what is the guaranteed speed to my particular property? Another point to bear in mind is that when you're looking for a new supplier, their adverts will probably suggest that a household needs about 36 to 75 megabytes. But they're basing this on a family. It's not sufficient for HMOs. The internet service providers simply don't understand the heavy data usage of separate adult households in a HMO. We had a client recently where we advised them to upgrade their Wi-Fi package to a business package, and we suggested the speed and the download and requirements and all of that. They phoned up their supplier, and their supplier talked them out of it on the basis of, you don't need that much bandwidth for a family of 5. What our client failed to explain was it's not a family of 5, it's 5 independent adult household users. So we'll see many of our clients these days have a personal laptop, a work laptop, they'll have a smart TV, they'll have an Xbox or a PlayStation, they'll have an Alexa or an Echo, and you know, you've got, so what's that? That's 5 devices for one person multiplied by 5 people in a HMO. Now if you've got a family of 5, they would share an Echo, they would share a smart TV. So you can see that the amount of extra data usage having tenants in a HMO does put on the system. Okay, continuing our history lesson a little bit. One of the things that we discovered, and I'm not sure if this is still the case, and actually the solution I'm going to share with you tonight gets rid of this problem. But going back to our 10-bed HMO that we had, after a while we found that the router would just crash, what we thought randomly for no apparent reason. Now the router stores the data of devices that have connected. So if you go to a friend's house, for example, and you log on to their Wi-Fi, when you go back and visit them a few weeks later, you don't have to re-enter the password. It remembers your device and the router remember each other, and you can just connect. Now this information is held in what's called a register. Now because we had a 10-person HMO, quite a high churn of tenants coming and going, but also visitors, contractors, people coming and going to the property. By the time that we had a problem with the router, it turned out that there were several hundred devices in the register for the router. And when we finally managed to speak to a service rep who knew what he was talking about, he's like, you shouldn't really have more than 10 devices on a router. It's like, that's why it's crashing. So we then took the decision to clear that out on a regular basis and do that manually. But as I say, the system that we now have got in place negates all of that. You don't need to worry about that. What we also found, particularly in our large property, is that the standard routers are not always powerful enough to reach all of the building, particularly if you've renovated a property or rejigged the rooms and you've put steels in. The Wi-Fi doesn't go through steel. The Wi-Fi signal can also be interrupted by household appliances like microwaves. So if you've got a room on the other side of a kitchen to the router, you might struggle to connect on the other side. Also interferes with the neighbours. What we've also discovered is that some devices call for and receive data over the preferences of others. So if you've got 5 devices linked to your router, the router doesn't share the data equally by default. It will look which device is essentially the strongest device, needs the most download, needs the most data, and will make sure that that device gets the data. So you might have various different tenants all connected, and one's okay and one's not getting any data. A point that you need to bear in mind is that as the bill payer for the Wi-Fi and HMOs, you're responsible for what is being streamed and downloaded by the tenants. It's your name on the bill. And the reason I raise this is we were approached by a landlord a few years ago now, to be fair, and he had a rather large HMO where his name was on the bill. He was on his third warning letter from Virgin, as they could tell that some of the tenants were illegally downloading various different packages or data or whatever. Now, he didn't know what it was, but he was the one getting the warning letter. Virgin could have taken action against him personally, and they could also have cut off the service to the property because they knew that it was being used for illegal purposes. I haven't seen any cases where that's actually resulted in any fines or anything, but it is a risk that you need to be aware of. What the pandemic has shown is that upload speeds can be just as important as download speeds. What I didn't realise is that upload speeds are really, really important for video calling in particular. So here we are on Zoom. When we first started getting into HMOs about 10 years ago, our tenants wanted to use Skype to keep in touch with their families. Now, I don't know anyone who uses Skype anymore, but I do know lots of people that use Zoom or FaceTime or WhatsApp video calling. You need the upload speed in order to have a stable call. So when you're on a call with someone and their video keeps flaking out or the sound keeps going in or out, it's probably because the Wi-Fi package they're on has got poor upload speeds. So when you're looking for service providers, you don't just look at the headline download speed, you want to check the upload speed as well. You might find that different service providers might have the same download functionality, download speeds, but one's cheaper than the other. And it's probably because they've got a lower upload speed, and so therefore they can charge you less. And finally, check out their customer service through reviews and through talking to other people. Don't believe everything you read on their own website. As part of our property management service, we ask our clients to give us authorisation to talk to utility suppliers on their behalf. So it's us sat on the phone for 5 hours on hold, not the client trying to sort out issues. However, we've just onboarded a new HMO for a new client, and he hadn't got round to giving us authorisation yet. We'd filled his HMO very quickly after refurb, and we were given the keys, and the tenants had been in for a few weeks, and then all of a sudden, as would happen on a Sunday morning, the internet goes off. And they were absolutely up in arms. It was the owner, the property owner, was the one that had to contact the service provider. He was on the phone and web chatting with somebody for 5 hours on Sunday trying to get it resolved. It couldn't be resolved. He was then on the phone for every day for the next 5 days until they could get an engineer out. The engineer came out on the following Friday. It actually took 2 engineers a full day to trace the problem, and what turned out to happen is that another contractor doing some other work had managed to disconnect them from the exchange, but it took that long to resolve the problem. So do check the customer service first, is all I would say. You definitely don't want to be on hold for 5 hours with your tenants throwing their toys out their pram. Which brings me on to the tenant's perspective of things. When we are conducting viewings in our HMOs, many tenants will ask about internet speeds. Again, as we've seen through the pandemic, many people now need or want to work from home, so having stable, fast Wi-Fi connection is really important for their job. Tenants, as I say, see Wi-Fi as the 5th utility service. They want to use as much data as they please, whenever they please, and they don't really care that that we have an aging, creaking infrastructure. They don't necessarily understand the restrictions on internet provision to your property. We also find that our tenants, so our tenant demographic is under 35, and I would say most of them, male and female these days, game seriously as a hobby. Some of them are almost like semi-professional. Now, gaming online is very, very data hungry. Even a most basic game, it needs at least 25 megabytes to use. Some of them, the really, really fast shoot 'em ups are over 100 megabytes. And tenants expect your Wi-Fi service to support this. And don't forget, if you've got 5 different people all in the HMO, all gaming at the same time, and you've only got 75 megabytes going into the property, you can imagine the chaos that this is going to cause. I've mentioned previously that tenants have many internet enabled devices, so not only have they got a mobile phone, but they've got laptops, smart TV, PlayStation, Xboxes, and they want to use them all at the same time. So they'll be on the PlayStation while streaming a film. So Wi-Fi is really important for them. We've talked about working from home, and tenants don't like to share. We have, in our properties, when we onboard a new property, we like to put in the system that I'm going to explain to you now from the very beginning. In some properties, we've put it in retrospectively, and what we found is that there is usually one tenant nearest to the router, and they get all the data because they're in close proximity to the router. So if they're gaming and watching the smart TV, they're fine, but somebody down the hallway can barely get on their mobile phone to check Facebook. When we put this system in that I'm going to explain now, the guy nearest the router starts complaining that he's not got as much internet provision, whereas the guy down the hall is made up because he can now get online and he can now connect his smart TV where previously he couldn't. Tenants really don't like to share. I did mention at the beginning that some tenants do view Wi-Fi as more essential than heat and hot water, and this is based on a real life experience. We have recently onboarded a HMO for a new client who had completely refurbished the property. However, unfortunately, and not a topic for this evening, but the build team were not the best. They failed to properly install a shower cubicle in the bathroom. So once we had the house full of tenants and the shower was getting used several times a day, by all the various tenants, after only about 2 or 3 weeks, the tiles around the shower started to fall off the wall because it hadn't been properly grouted, hadn't had the plasterboard put on correctly, the shower base wasn't siliconed in properly. We ended up having to rip out the whole shower enclosure, replaster, and retile. Now obviously throughout this process we had to let the plaster dry for a couple of days, we had to let the grout dry for a couple of days. Fortunately, this HMO was in part of a commercial conversion that the owner was doing, and right next door in this commercial property he was creating a 2-bedroom flat. Now the bathroom in that flat had been renovated, and so what we had to do was we had to give the keys to the flat to the HMO tenants for about 10 days for them to go and shower next door. Basically, they were all fine with this, no problems whatsoever. They just, after about a week or so, they were like, oh, how's it going? Can we shower yet? What's going on? This is the same HMO where the internet went off on a Sunday morning. Within minutes we were inundated with the tenants going, I can't get online, I can't do this, I can't play on my PlayStation. They were absolutely distraught. So my point here is, do not underestimate the importance of Wi-Fi to your tenants. It is a really important service provision, and if you're looking at wanting to provide a really good service to your tenants and to help persuade them to stay in your property for the longer term, then this is a serious consideration. Which brings me on to the solution. So for all of these problems that I've outlined, there is a solution to this, which we have investigated and we have put in our properties and used successfully for many, many years now. And the solution is something called a mesh network. Now we use Open Mesh, which is a brand name. But the mesh Wi-Fi network is a generic term. And you do need this, so you need your standard internet service provider. So you need BT, Virgin, EE, whoever you've got, with your standard router. This system overlays on top of that. So think more like hotel service provision. What we have got, the system we've got with Open Mesh is you buy individual units. They're called access points. Now the business model Open Mesh have is you buy the access units, you plug them into your standard router, and then you can manage your Wi-Fi usage in your property remotely, so through a cloud website, which is great. You don't have to go to the property all of the time, and there are no ongoing costs with that. Now unfortunately Open Mesh are phasing out this service provision effectively for new customers. So there are other service providers out there. So if this is a solution that sounds great for your HMOs, I'm suggesting you go and search other service providers. Don't just jump onto Open Mesh, because they are at end of life and will be reducing their service provision shortly. But there are other service providers out there. The new service providers tend to work more on a subscription-based service, so the cost of the access points is lower. We were talking several hundreds of pounds, so it was quite expensive to install in the first place. So their upfront costs are a lot lower, and then there's an ongoing monthly subscription to use their service. But it is an easy installation at the property. It's effectively plug and play. It's really easy to install. So let me tell you a little bit more about how it works. You can provide wired or wireless internet to users. If you're providing wired service, you do really need to be installing this at the time of refurbishing your property. So think of this effectively as rewiring. So when you rewire the property, you want to be burying the internet cables within the walls as well. But wireless works just fine. All of our systems are wireless and we don't have any issues at all. The access points, it says booster here, but it's not really a booster. The access point acts as a second router, so it makes sure that the Wi-Fi signal reaches every part of the property. And some of these you can actually get external access points as well. So if you've got a large garden, for example, that the tenants use in summer, you can actually put one of these units outside so that they can get Wi-Fi in the garden. It's easy to scale up the system, so if you make an extension or add another room at some point in the future, it's easy to scale up. You can create private or public networks. So again, you know, I've mentioned hotels. Think hotels. When your tenant logs on for the very first time, they'll get a screen. You know, when you go to a hotel, it says, "Welcome to XYZ Hotel. Enter your email address and connect to our network." That's the sort of thing that you can set up on these systems. They're really flexible as well, so the access points can have an external power supply. They do need to be plugged into the router, or they can use a PoE injector. So this basically means power over Ethernet. This is effectively one cable which provides power to the unit and also the broadband provision. The PoE injector is our preferred option just because it means you've then got less cables and less plugs. But if you haven't got, you know, a PoE injector box or whatever, you can just plug it into the normal power supply. You can have multiple sites, so this is multiple properties. We must have about a dozen properties on our listing now. You can just go onto one website and you have a drop down menu of all of the different properties where the system is installed, and you can control most things through a cloud-based website. So previously, where you know, sometimes a router does need rebooting, you need to physically go to the property and turn it off and turn it back on again to reset it. With this system, you no longer need to do that. You can do all the rebooting remotely, which is really good. So, you know, if we're on holiday or traveling and the tenants phone up with a Wi-Fi issue, we can simply log in and pretty much sort it out there and then for them, which is fantastic. This system does give you the option to set and change upload and download speeds. So we talked earlier about if you've got a property which has a restricted amount of input coming to the property because of infrastructure issues, you can share that information much more fairly across tenants and across devices. So it gets rid of the whole problem of the guy nearest the router gobbling up all of the data. This shares it much more fairly. You can brand the network, so if you want to put your own logo or whatever on the page that the tenants log into, you can do that. With the open mesh system, there is a functionality where you can connect to via PayPal, so you can make a charge if you want to. So for example, if you you knew there were frequent visitors to the property, you could make a nominal charge for people to access the Wi-Fi in your property. You don't have to do that, that's just an option. I don't think all service providers do offer that, but again, you know, if you're just providing Wi-Fi for your tenants, it's probably not so much of an issue. Okay, so the benefits is, as I say, you can manage data usage to suit the incoming data supply. So you can set upload and download speeds, and this took me a while to get my head around. It seems quite paradoxical, really, that by restricting the amount of download speed each individual person can have, you can actually improve the Wi-Fi provision across a property. We have just installed this in another of our clients' HMOs. I think there's five or six tenants in this HMO. It's quite a big old Victorian property. And some of the tenants furthest away from the router were definitely complaining that they were struggling to get online. One of the things that really upsets tenants when they're gaming is something called latency or lag. This means if they're, you know, like creeping up behind somebody to shoot them, what can happen is someone else appears out of nowhere and they're dead. And that's because there has been, you know, maybe a second delay in their game refreshing the screen, and they've not seen somebody creeping up on them. This really upsets them. But by maintaining the download and upload speeds consistently across all of the devices, actually make sure they've got a more stable connection, so it actually gives them a better service, bizarrely, but it does really work. We talked earlier about the risk of you being the bill payer and people illegally downloading things. This system completely negates that risk. It captures the MAC addresses of all of the people and devices logging into the system, so you know who's logged on, when they're logged on, how long for. So if there are any issues with illegal downloads, you can't see what websites they're going on, you can't see what they're doing, but you can see when they're connected to the system, and you can see the unique MAC addresses. So if you were investigated by the police, for example, you can have that data, and hopefully the supply would be able to you'd be able to prove that it's not you doing the illegal downloads. We did try parental locks before we got open mesh to negate that risk of illegal downloads, but as I say, at the time many of our tenants were coming from Eastern Europe, and what we found was that parental locks just simply didn't like websites that weren't in English, so they were blocking the most benign of sites simply because it was in Czech or Polish. So it just wasn't a tenable option for us to use that functionality to mitigate that risk. But as I say, with this system, that completely goes away. The great thing about it is controlled remotely. Steve's been sat by a pool on holiday and sorted out a Wi-Fi issue for a tenant. So the tenant's made up, it's fixed instantly. You don't have to send anybody to the property You don't have to go yourself. It's just a lot easier to use. One thing that we really like about it is there is a secure connection, so you can provide open networks or secure networks. We make sure that all the connections we use are secure, so that means they're password protected. Each tenant has a password, and when they log into the system they create a unique voucher code, so it's unique to them. And this is really important for us because we recognise that the tenants living in our HMOs, this is their home, this is where they live. And, you know, particularly if they're doing online banking, we want to make sure that they're secure. So this is a much better system than what you'd get in a cafe, for example, where it's an unsecured network. If you do want to make a charge or to the system for visitors or tenants, you can offer vouchers, so you can then make that free for a set period of time if that's something you wanted to do. So let's say, for example, you know, one of your tenants did a particularly good deed, you know, you could reward them with free Wi-Fi for a certain period of time. The service that we use offers up to 4 different networks. I think some of the newer suppliers offer many more networks than this that you can use for different purposes. So for example, we have got one hidden network that is just for our staff. So what this means is that when we or our staff go to the property, there is a network that nobody else knows is there, nobody else uses, so it's secure, and you haven't got loads of people competing for its use. So you know, when you're on your phone and you use you know, you go switch Wi-Fi on, it will bring up a list of available Wi-Fi networks. This won't appear in that list. You have to physically click on join network, and you need to know the name of the network to type in order to log into it. So that's just really useful for us and for any staff that we've got going to the property. You can have a separate network for tenants, and then if you want, you can have a paid for service for neighbours or visitors. So our big 10-person HMO, we did have quite a lot of people who lived in nearby HMOs where the Wi-Fi was a little bit naff. They would come and you know, wander past our property and pay to connect for a few minutes to get online. So that again is on a separate network, because what we don't want is loads of visitors jumping on the network and impacting the service for tenants. So this helps keep it all separate, so that our tenants have the best possible experience that they can have. Right, okay, so in summary, I've already said this, but I can't reiterate it enough, is don't underestimate the importance of reliable fast Wi-Fi for your tenants. As I say, we do get tenants on viewings asking what the speed is. They'll try and do ping tests on their phone potentially, to make sure that the internet provision is up to their expectations and their requirements. You know, we have had tenants in the past who actually work for gaming companies, so their job is to write code for games. So it is really important for people working from home that they do have this as a service. And as I say, tenants view it as an essential service. Some of our tenants do say to us that they stay in our properties longer because they know that they've got a decent internet connection, and you know, they're loath to leave because they're not quite sure of the internet service provision of where they're going to. So it can be one of those points that encourages people to stay in your property and to take the room in the first place. You know, if you know that you can offer this as a really good service, you can put this in your marketing, you can let people know on viewings. You know, tenants are getting more and more savvy these days, particularly if they've been around the HMO block a few times. We'll get tenants on viewings that turn the shower on to check the water pressure, because the previous house they lived in, the water pressure was rubbish and they couldn't have a decent shower. We'll get tenants lifting up the mattress and looking for stains on the mattress because the last place they lived in, the mattress was filthy. And Wi-Fi is another one of those things that they want to know about before they move into the property. So one of the things to check is what service is available for your property. We've talked about ageing infrastructure, so you do need to check what is available for your property and to look what the best cost-effective service is for your property, whether that's a HMO or a single let, although obviously we've been focusing on HMOs here. And then if you are using a managing agent, speak to your managing agent about this. Make sure that they understand how important Wi-Fi is to you and your tenants and why it's an essential service, and ask them how do they manage Wi-Fi issues. If you've just got a standard router in there and tenants are complaining, your managing agent might just assume that this is just like, oh, it's run of the mill, it's typical, all tenants complain about Wi-Fi. But you can actually do something about it. You can actually provide a better service to your tenants. Many managing agents probably haven't heard of this open mesh Wi-Fi system. So it is a good idea to have a chat with them and make sure that you can offer the best service that you possibly can to your tenants.